So today I just wanted to share with you, I'll stand on this other side, and talk a little bit about risk perception. I think, anytime you bring up the precautionary principle, having a conversation about risk perception is certainly worthwhile. And so I'm going to talk a little bit, and this kind of step back from what we've been doing, definitely a little less applied, but talk a little bit about the theory and the drivers behind risk perception and kind of the state of the art in research related to risk perception, without getting hopefully too researchy. And then talk a little bit about what kind of research is being done, looking at the impacts on risk perception and a few other factors on producer cooperation. And then lastly, I'll touch on the research that was done in Texas, specifically looking at Texas cattle producer cooperation with foot and mouth disease, emergency response, and the potential effects of risk perception on that cooperation. So this is a really interesting picture, I think. When you think about risk perception, and this kind of went viral, and nobody knows where it came from. So if you know this guy, let me know. I'd love to know his name. So here you have these guys in these hazmat suits with oxygen tanks, and then this dude. And so he is the guy in the pink shirt. And so he actually has like a website, and they did cutouts of him and stuck him in random places, and he's become famous. So if any of you know him, you should let him know. But what is risk perception, right? So what does it mean? And here we have, these people obviously have a different perception of whatever this risk is than this guy, who looks rather nonchalant about the whole thing. So, thinking a little bit about risk perception, Paul Slovic was kind of the father of modern thinking about risk perception, and he published an article in 2004 called Risk as Analysis and Risk as Feelings. And a lot of this work grew out of the growth of risk analysis, particularly related to environmental risk assessments. And so there was a real need to better understand the conflict of the results of risk assessments with public opinions about what should be done. And there was a lot of conflict going on the environmental side and hazardous waste site locations and nuclear energy, and a lot of those other things were going on. It was really hot at the time, and so there was all this conflict, and people wanted to say, well, why? We have the science. We can show you what the risk is. Why do we have this conflict? And so it was really a lot of these people from the social science who came back and said, well, you think you understand what the risk is, but in truth, you don't understand what risk is at all for most people. And so it was trying to get at a better way to understand that dialogue. And so, let's go back. There are basically two fundamental ways in which people comprehend risk, two kind of systems that are employed. The first is the analytic system, which probably more closely mirrors what we think about in terms of a risk analysis. It's kind of that probabilistic approach. It's very rational. It's based on judging risks and rewards and those sorts of things. And then there's an experiential system that is more intuitive. It's more kind of based on your gut reaction to something. And it's not something that's easily explained or quantified. And so both of those systems are really important. This is a funny little cartoon that talks about risk perception, I guess, and how we determine the risk. And so you have two people meeting on the street, and they come up with this list of risk factors and then a list of mitigating factors. And as long as the mitigating factors are greater than the risk factors, then they can say hello, right? So this would be an example of the analytic system of risk perception being employed in everyday life. So obviously, this is not a system that's often employed in everyday life, right? Who's going to go through this to decide whether or not to greet somebody on the street or turn on a light switch or do any of those things? So in fact, although the analytic system is very appealing to us as scientists, in fact, most people never use it. Or they use it very rarely and only on certain risks, right? So most people simply stick with this experiential system. And that's how they perceive risk, and they judge which risks are acceptable and which risks aren't. Kind of going back again to Slovic's work, he also published an article called The Risk Game, in which he made some, I guess, somewhat controversial statements at the time about what risk was and the importance of risk perception. And so thinking again about kind of risk assessments and the risk analysis process, what is risk? We think of it as kind of a likelihood and a consequence, and it's something very definable in a way. But in truth, social scientists would tell you or would argue that, in fact, even this definition is fraught with judgments and with assumptions and with your own values that you bring to the table. And I think most people who are involved in risk analysis and risk assessments today would understand that, and they need to be very transparent about the decisions that are made and those judgments and approaches that are taken. But just as we as scientists have our kind of risk assessments, the way that we judge and evaluate risks, lay people also have their own mechanisms, right? So they have their own models, their own assumptions, subjective assessment techniques, all these things that they're employing at the same time as we are to make a decision about whether a risk is acceptable or not. So the bottom line is that all risk is inherently subjective, right? So when you decide that something is a risk worth doing something about, or you decide that a risk is not worth doing something about, that is at its root a subjective assessment. No matter how objectively we can try to quantify that decision or explain that decision, it's still completely steeped in values and judgments and decisions about what's more important or what's less important. So when we think about risk perception and how people come up with their risk perception, and we're mostly interested because, A, we either want to influence that risk perception, we want to change how people perceive a risk, or we want to use their risk perception to drive a behavior, right? So we want them to do something. And this is really common in any kind of health setting, right? So in animal health, we often want them to do biosecurity. We want them to get involved. We want them to, report disease. But if you don't understand what forms that risk perception, how that risk perception works, influencing it is really difficult. Or even capitalizing on the risk perception that is there can be really difficult. So when people think about risk, they use a lot of these shortcuts. So you might have heard the term heuristics. It's kind of become popular in the social science literature. But they're like mental shortcuts. And so something like a risk image. So somebody says the word nuclear, and everybody has an image that comes to mind, right? So maybe it's the little, hazard symbol. Or maybe it's Chernobyl. Or maybe it's a nuclear bomb cloud, mushroom cloud, or, everybody has an image that comes to mind. And those risk images are incredibly powerful at driving risk perception. So you put the word nuclear in front of anything, and that risk image that comes to mind then drives your risk perception related to whatever that article was. And so things like foot and mouth disease also have powerful risk images in a lot of people's minds. And obviously the images from the 2001 outbreak in the UK of the huge pyres of burning animals, all of those things went on to impact people's risk images and probably to this day continue to have an impact on producers and the public's risk perception related to something like foot and mouth disease. So those kind of shortcuts, those quick ways to estimate risk are incredibly important. And they can't just be ignored, and they can't be rationalized away with scientific facts. Unfortunately, most people, because they do rely so heavily on this experiential system for evaluating risks, even coming at them with an analytic answer to that risk often has no influence on their attitudes, no influence on their behavior or their perceptions. So it's important to understand more completely some of these other factors that are driving risk perception and be able to address those and understand those. So what are some of these other drivers? There are a lot of things: knowledge, experience, values, attitudes, moral beliefs, emotions, just what mood you're in when you get the information has a big impact. Everybody knows that when you go tell your boss something and you kind of ask around, what kind of mood are they in? Because what mood they're in is going to determine how they receive that information. So all of those things have an important influence. When people have to make a judgment about how serious is a risk, how acceptable is a risk, what am I going to do about it? So Slovic, in his paper, The Risk Game, concluded that there's no such thing as real risk, as attributed by experts. There's only real danger. Risk is this construct that we created to help us deal with things like uncertainty and the dangers that are around us every day. It's a coping mechanism in a way to have this terminology and be able to discuss it. And so it's important that we all realize that, when you talk about risk, in truth, things either happen or they don't, right? But the risk itself is something that we can talk about. There's a risk that F&B will hit, you won't be able to move your milk. So what are you going to do about that? And it's a point of dialogue. But it's not a guaranteed percentage of probability, no matter how well we might quantify it. So I was just going to talk a little bit about this diagram, and I apologize because I know it's tiny. These people who publish, in these articles, they aren't very considerate when they make these diagrams that you want to share them later. So we're going to kind of blow it up and explore it. But this actually came from a group who were looking at how do people form risk perceptions, and they work they're called water practitioners. So they work in resource sharing related to water, which you can also imagine gets to be rather touchy and controversial, somewhat similar to maybe foot and mouth disease and some of these other things. But they basically say that there are two things. You have a risk object and an object at risk, right? So something like foot and mouth disease, which then puts things like your livelihood, your animal health, your international markets, your profitability, your reputation, all those things at risk. Okay, so you have this relationship between the two. And you're going to form a perception of the risk of foot and mouth disease, for example. So what drives that? And this is all based on the most current research. So they went through the literature and they said, okay, what are the influences that we know drive risk perception? So things like knowledge, attitudes, particularly those related to trust, a sense of fairness, things like perceived control over that risk or exposure to that risk, are all direct influences on risk perception. And so each of these can have a direct impact on how you perceive that risk. But underneath these, at the root of them, there are other things. And so one is this social identity. So things like your values, what do you value? Whether it's, my family farm and the fact that I'm going to pass this on to my children, or whether it's, I have 40 years of genetics and breeding in these animals, whether it's, I run the most professional company, we always meet our deadlines, we're, just great about our profit margins, whatever it is that you value, whatever it is that drives you, then goes on to influence things like your attitudes and your trust levels. And those values are often mediated through group membership. So who do you belong with? Who do you identify with? All of those different things that make up your social identity. And at its root, your social identity is just who do you think that you are? How do you define yourself? At the same time, you have a cultural identity. So all the people around me have these expectations, these kind of cultural norms of what's expected for us to do. And those drive what are called subjective norms. So what do you think other people expect you to do, and what do you expect other people to do? I expect my neighbors to do this, and they expect me to behave this way in relation to a risk. And so cultural identity is kind of what do you think you know about how the world works and how your neighbors work and how your society works. And at their heart, these two, cultural identity and social identity, who you think you are and what you think you know, drive risk perception. All of these different things go in to be kind of processed simultaneously, right? So this isn't step by step. Nobody walks through. This is all happening at the same time, often without us even knowing what influence any one factor is having. But they come in through both kind of cognitive, sort of, rational benefits and consequences approaches, as well as affective reactions, so emotion-based things. So things like dread, if it's going to be really catastrophic, all of those factors come into account on kind of this emotional side, and they all become weighted to form a risk perception about what's going to be impacted. So you might say, well, that's great, Amy. We're all so excited to know that now. But what we really care about is action, right? So what are people going to do, and how do we get them on board with what needs to be happening? Or how do we prevent them from doing something that would be really distractive or really disruptive during an outbreak? So unfortunately, the connection between risk perception, willingness to act, and then actually taking some sort of risk preparedness action is still really unclear. And there hasn't been a lot of research done in this area, particularly related to animal health. So what I did was I kind of went back through the literature and I found some nice articles that talked about this particular relationship, but related to disaster preparedness. So these are people who are preparing for hurricanes and floods, tornadoes, and that sort of things. And they said, what has been shown to have an influence on risk preparedness? So how likely is it that people are going to take some preparedness action that we're asking them to take? And so they looked at several factors. These are all the different ones. And said, okay, which of these influence risk perception, and which of these influence actual action, right? So risk preparedness. And what they found is that risk factors, like just the likelihood and magnitude of a disaster, had no effect on behavior. So that people just don't take that into account. They don't think along those lines, and that's really not too surprising. Informational factors were important, but only in the absence of direct experience. So people who had never lived through a flood, would really count on somebody coming to tell them, like, this is what the flood's going to be like, and these are the things that you need to do. But once a person has direct experience, the value of those informational sources go way, way, way down. But if they are going to rely on informational sources, then trust in those informational sources is important. personal factors like your age, your income, your gender, some of those things were never found to have a clear relationship on those, and so they always seem to fall out of models, even though we all try and keep them into model behavior. The two most important were direct experience. So people who had direct experience with disaster in general could be seen as more likely to take precautionary actions in the future. However, it could also have a negative effect. So people who have gone through a disaster but weren't really impacted, or who had minimal impacts, may downplay that disaster in the future. So you live in an area that's prone to flooding, but every time it floods, it just never really hits your house. The last two floods just didn't have an impact. So in your mind, the perception of that risk is really small. And so, in industry, maybe there's been some of these outbreaks, but it's never really hit me, and therefore I feel like the risk is small, even though based on the industry structure, you're very much at risk. And so direct experience can be very helpful, but it can also be hurtful. It can make people downplay a risk that they should be taking more seriously. And then lastly, trust, particularly in authorities, and confidence in protective measures were all shown to be very important for getting people to take protective or precautionary measures. So we're going to talk a little bit more about trust, because I think it is such an important factor affecting risk perception, but also affecting willingness to act. And so this is just a definition of trust that was put forward by several people and kind of gets repeated in all the social science literature. But basically, trust is a willingness to accept some vulnerability because you believe in the positive expectations that somebody else is going to do something in a good way. So you have these positive expectations of the intentions or behavior of another. But I think it's important, the idea of a willingness to accept vulnerability because you're trusting somebody else to take care of it, right? I found this very interesting, and the trust research has really come a long way just recently in understanding and being able to tease apart what goes into trust and why we trust who we trust. But this idea that trust is resilient. We trust who we trust, right? And that's kind of funny because the common saying, right, is trust is hard to earn and easy to lose. Those kind of sayings. But in truth, trust is actually easy to earn because it's often done in a heuristic way. People look at you and they say, you know what? I feel like we have the same goal in mind. Jim and I, we're going to the same place. We want the same thing during an F&B outbreak, right? We want producers to stay in business. We want to deal with the disease quickly. I really trust him, right? But confidence, on the other hand, is very fragile because confidence is based on a discrete, singular action, right? So I have confidence that he's going to get this paper out by next month, right? And then if that doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen again, then my confidence in him to get those things done is going to be zero, right? So I might still trust him, but I don't have a lot of confidence that he's going to meet the deadlines, for example. Not that you would ever do that, never. But so that's just an example. So trust is something that's more resilient. It's more long-term. Confidence, on the other hand, can be very fragile. And so I think having newly joined kind of USDA and understanding that there is a wonderful thing about having trust and knowing that you are seen as a trusted partner in a lot of things, and understanding that the confidence that the producers place in USDA or that they place in their other partners is fragile, and it needs to be based on results, right, and getting things done. And some of the research that I'll show you in a few minutes that came out of Texas actually kind of teased apart some of those things and looked at what had the most effect on producer behavior. So again, you say, great, Amy, that was really fun. But what we care about, right, is producer cooperation. And how do we get producers on board with what we're doing, and how do we have a good dialogue with them? And does it even matter, right? So does risk perception, does trust, any of these things really have an impact during a disease outbreak or even during emergency preparedness activities? And so I pulled together just a few of the studies that have come out in recent years looking at the effects of things like trust and risk perception on some of these things that were done in other countries. So there isn't tons of this work done in the U.S., but if you kind of take a global view, there's quite a bit. So this first study was a study done in the Netherlands looking at reporting of pigs with clinical signs consistent with classical swine fever. And so this is a reporting that was paid for by the government. All the testing is paid for. And yet they found that a lot of farmers, if you ask them directly, you know, would you report pigs with signs of classical swine fever? And they're like, no, I don't want to, you know, and they had really negative opinions about the disease control measures. And when they began to explore those, and this was a qualitative study, you know, why is that? They found that there were all these negative emotions associated with going through that reporting process, things like guilt, things like shame, having the guys with the white suits show up on your farm. But then also there was this lack of trust in the government bodies. And this is despite having handled a CSF outbreak in recent years. And maybe due to having handled a CSF outbreak in recent years. But that lack of trust was really impacting the willingness of producers to report disease. In Australia, they were more interested in biosecurity measures. And how could they get their producers to support and take on certain biosecurity measures, including reporting, for a variety of kind of foreign animal diseases. And they found that things like perceived risk were really important in influencing willingness to report. And so when a producer didn't perceive the risk to be high, they would write that off. Even though maybe a veterinarian said it was a good differential, they would say, oh no, you know, according to their perceived risk, that wasn't an issue, and the reporting might never happen. And that trust in others contributed significantly to their perceived risk. So if they trusted their neighbors, they trusted the government and their border controls, they actually had less perceived risk and they were less likely to report. But it was all kind of combined, and there was a lot of interplay between those factors. In the UK, which obviously has a very complicated history when it comes to trust and disease control and all those different things, there's been a lot of recent work done trying to get at understanding producers better, trying to design better rules and regulations, and especially because they're trying to go toward more of a cost-sharing approach to disease control. And so some of the early research that was done, they were looking at, you know, if the government comes out and says you have to do these biosecurity measures, right? So if this is regulation from DEFRA that says this is how it has to be, how desirable or how willing would producers be to undertake those measures? And what they found is that most of the producers did not like the biosecurity measures. Not that the biosecurity measures were necessarily bad or ineffective, but that they felt that they didn't trust the government and that it was really the government's job to prevent FMD or prevent foreign animal diseases and not their own farm practices that had an influence on that. So they were kind of pushing the responsibility for that back on the government and not really willing to adopt those measures. So that's really interesting. In a lot of countries that have dealt with major disease outbreaks and who have kind of learned through that and had some studies done by social scientists. But I always feel like the U.S. is a unique place. Just like every place, it's a unique place. And sometimes that research doesn't always resonate with us, right? Because it was done somewhere else with a different sort of attitudes and beliefs and social and cultural norms that drive that. So lastly, I'm just going to present a little bit of research that was done in Texas with cattle producers. And this was part of a much larger study looking at predicting behavior related to foot and mouth disease control. And so rather than talk about all this, I'm just going to pull out the parts related to risk perception or emphasize the parts related to risk perception and trust to kind of maybe give them some context here in the U.S. So all of this research is pulled out of a study. There was a qualitative phase that was published in 2012, and that kind of designed the theoretical framework of how we were going to model and predict behavior among producers. And there was a quantitative phase that was a mail-out survey. So we mailed it out to just over 2,000 producers. There were two surveys, so 4,000 producers got it in the mail, and then we used the results of that survey to build some ordinal logistic regression models to find out what were the best predictors of behavior. If you really want to know all the statistical details, ask me later. I won't bore you with them now. So these are the behaviors that we were interested in. There were four. Reporting both before and during an outbreak of FMD, movement ban compliance, and then gathering and hold compliance. So if you get an order to gather and hold your herd for testing or for depopulation or for vaccination or for whatever, how willing are you or what's your intent to do that? And these were behaviors that were identified through that qualitative phase with interviews with state animal health officials, with producers across Texas that might be points of contention where compliance could be variable. In modeling behavior, we drew from the social science literature. So this is psychometric paradigm if you're into that sort of stuff. But basically it just says that behavior is determined by first an intent to behave. So you have to want to do it and then you do it. This is really handy for people who want to measure stuff because sometimes you can't measure behavior, right? So we can't measure what producers do during an F&D outbreak because we didn't have one. But we can measure their intent to behave. And research would tell us that intent to behave is a decent predictor of behavior, right? It's not perfect predictor. You can intend to do something and then never do it, right? But as many of us know, with health and diet and exercise, right? but it is, depending on the behavior and the situation, it can be a decent predictor of behavior. And so in the case of F&D in the U.S., this is what you're left with to measure, right? Intent to behave. The theory would say, this is the theory of planned behavior by Isaac Agen, the theory would say that your intent to behave is driven by your attitudes, which are kind of the overall good, bad evaluation of that behavior, your subjective norms, which is what other people would expect you to do, and your perceived behavioral control, which is how easy or how difficult is it to do that behavior. And if all of these things are favorable to form an intent, assuming you actually have control, you actually have the ability to do it, then the theory would say that you would then go on to perform that behavior. When we started the study and we looked at these, and then we did the qualitative analysis and a lot of interviews and we talked to a lot of people, we felt like although this was useful, it wasn't complete and there were a lot of other issues that were missing. So some of the other things that we added on included trust, risk perception, and then moral norms. And we found that in relation, particularly in agriculture, moral beliefs about what is it that you need to do, regardless of what anybody else thinks, what is it you feel you should do, are really important with producers. And so these are things that kind of got added onto the study and assessed along with the others. Unfortunately, moral norms, while they were really interesting, they were so prevalent. Everybody agreed. I'm morally obligated to care for my animals. I'm morally obligated to provide veterinary care. They were so prevalent that they just fell out of the model because there was no variability in responses. All the producers had really strong moral beliefs about animal health and welfare.
That's the agriculture world.
So the behavioral intention. These are the results of those studies. And you can see we asked it on a 5-point Likert-like scale, ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And so each of these would be introduced with a scenario in the survey, and they say, okay, based on this scenario, would you intend to report cattle with clinical signs consistent with FMD? Strongly agree, strongly disagree. Amazingly, we had 8% of producers mostly to strongly disagree and say, no, I'm not going to report. And I'll show you the scenarios that we used to introduce these. They weren't like vague signs of FMD. They were, ranging plain signs of FMD, very consistent with FMD. What we did find was that during an outbreak, the proportion of producers saying that they wouldn't report dropped off significantly. So we went from 8% to 3%. Gather and hold, so this is would you gather and hold your cattle when requested by animal health authorities during an outbreak of FMD. Again, 8% disagreed. Movement restrictions, so would you keep your cattle in place, basically indefinitely, during an FMD outbreak? Only 1% mostly disagreed. And these are just among cow-calf producers. And again, just in Texas. So here's a scenario that was used to introduce reporting in the absence of an outbreak. And so here you have, they're depressed, reluctant to move, noticeably lame, and they're drooling. And I won't go into all, right, again, so there's a lot of data here in the study, and I'm not going to go into all of that. But instead, I really just want to kind of focus on risk perception. So we measured probably close to 300 variables, social, psychological, as well as kind of socioeconomic variables, and tested them all to come up with the best model to predict behavior. So what were the key variables influencing behavior? And these are what they came out to be for reporting prior to an outbreak. So what we found is behavioral beliefs, which is basically beliefs that in the positive outcomes of doing it. So if I do this, I'm going to have better animal health, or it's important for my herd's health, it's important to prevent the spread of disease. The more strongly you believe those things, the more likely you are to report. If you believe that other producers would also report cattle with FMD, then you are more likely to report. So all of these are odds ratios. And for the non-epidemiologists in the room, so the larger the odd ratio, the more likely than the outcome is, and in this case the outcome is reporting. So producers who believed in the positive consequences of reporting had 10.3 times greater odds of reporting. or intent to report. Trust also fell into this model, particularly in the competency of agricultural agencies. And so I'll show you the factor analysis that was done on this data to try and understand this is social science, right? So you have to say, what did I actually measure? And factor analysis is one way to get at that. What did we actually measure with our questions? Which is kind of unique to the social science approach. But when this factor analysis was done, what we ended up actually measuring was belief in the competency of agricultural agencies. And we found that as they increased, you did have increased odds of reporting, but most noticeably when they were lower, right, you had definite decreased odds of reporting. And then here's risk perception, kind of the interest of the day, related to the magnitude of the consequences. And you'll see this kind of repeatedly as we look at these different models that were built for the behaviors, is that the effects of risk perception weren't consistent. It wasn't just the more risk perception you have, the more compliant you are, right? So instead, risk perception at kind of moderate to medium levels, in fact, does have an increased behavior. But when you get out to the extreme, right, so this is divided on the standard deviation. When you get out to the extreme, really high levels of risk perception related to the magnitude of the consequences of FMD, your reporting bottomed out, right? Producers said, no. Right, so risk perception is good up until a point, and then when the perception that it's the end of the world hits, behavior drops off, right? Which kind of makes sense, but it doesn't always make sense in the way that we communicate with producers. And I think that was one of the things that really came out of the study was this idea, we want to scare producers, or we want to scare people about FMD, and we want to let them know how bad it is and how awful it's going to be so that they do whatever it is that needs to be done. But you don't realize that sometimes you can drive risk perception, drive that fear out to the point that they aren't going to do anything, right? You've just shut off whatever cooperation you might have had. So a couple other things that fell into the model, experience with other disease control programs. So we specifically asked about brucellosis and TB. And then also stalkers. It was kind of interesting that it got into this model in particular. So people who had a lot of stalkers, well over 50 head of stalkers, were more likely to report. Here's the actual risk perception measures that we used. So you can see these are the questions that were asked, and these are the proportion of respondents weighted based on the sampling design, again, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. The darker colors are the higher proportions, so it's kind of shaded out for you so you don't have to read numbers necessarily. But what you found is that a lot of people didn't really know. So the very first question is, the risk of an outbreak of foot and mouth disease in the U.S. is very great. And you get a lot of people here in the center, right? So they don't know, they neither agree nor disagree. In social sciences terms, that's ambivalence, okay? But then you say, the risk of an outbreak of foot and mouth disease in my operation is very great. And everybody says, no. Right, so we all shift over. So the U.S. might be at risk, but I'm not. And that's not uncommon in a lot of risk perception research. Down here we have economic consequences. So would it be economically devastating for you? Would it be economically devastating for the U.S.? And they all said, yeah, we think so. Okay, so they tend to fall out on the agree side. If you ask about likelihood, you say, is the U.S. likely to experience an outbreak of foot and mouth disease in the next 5 years? And everybody's like, I don't know, maybe. So they're all here in the middle. But there's quite a few. You can see the tail tends to go this way towards saying no, it's not. And then, is their operation likely to experience an outbreak in the next 5 years? And they all say no. So when we got these results, the next step is to do a factor analysis on them. And again, a factor analysis is in social science kind of a way to figure out, what did I actually measure? What are the constructs that underlie this data? And so when you do that, it tells you and says, okay, well, these things are alike, and these things are alike, and they are not like each other, right? So they spread out. So what are these? Up here we have kind of these economic devastation questions, and then down here we have the risk and probability, risk and likelihood questions. And so they did fall apart separately and were in fact two different constructs. And it was this, the economic devastation, that went into the model and really was shown to be a significant predictor of willingness to report. So just really kind of quickly, this is the trust question. So competency to manage their role. This is how well do you think these different agencies would manage their role during an outbreak of foot and mouth disease. And so what you find is that the agricultural agencies are here at the top. So this was, again, done in Texas. So we have USDA and then TDA, Texas Department of Agriculture, and the Texas Animal Health Commission. And you can see that all of them fell on the much higher end in terms of beliefs in their competency to manage their role. That looks good, right? Right, Dee? Isn't that good? And then you find all the other agencies like DHS and FEMA. The what? That's true. I do have the spaghetti, though. We could talk about that another time. And then we have all the other agencies that people were like, yeah, we don't know what they're going to do and how it's going to go. So not surprisingly, these did fall into two different factors. And so you have kind of the ag agencies and the non-ag agencies. And it was really trust in ag agencies that drives reporting behavior. When we looked at reporting during an outbreak, we found that it actually was a little different. Both risk perceptions, both kind of related to risk and probability as well as magnitude of the consequences went into the model. This one you can see the standard errors get a little bit high, but still highly significant predictors. And again, you see the greatest effect when you have kind of this intermediate risk perception. But during an outbreak, you don't get that huge drop off, so it never becomes negative. Like it did earlier, where you would actually say, I'm not reporting because my risk perception is so high. You're just less, maybe a little less likely to report, for example, here, once the risk perception gets really high. And then here, it doesn't ever, risk perception is a good thing. The more you believe in the consequences, the more likely you are to report during an outbreak. The key message, I guess, that we took from this was that the context matters. So whether there's an outbreak going on or whether it's just kind of routine day-to-day surveillance, producers think about those things very differently. And they have different influences on what they would do. So when you're designing risk communication messages, for example, things that you use during peacetime may not be as appropriate or as impactful during wartime. And so they really need to be unique for that context. So I know there's a lot of effort and a lot of interest in kind of pre-planning and designing those communication strategies and those communication messages. And so it's important to kind of know what is the context in which we're going to be communicating and what is most likely to be impactful and meaningful in that context. Interesting enough, once you had an outbreak going on, people who had previously dealt with eradication programs, who had TB or brucellosis, said, no, we're not going to report. Which is the opposite of what we had before the outbreak. That was very interesting. So the other behavior was gather and hold. So again, here's the scenario that introduced it. You're contacted, asked to gather and hold your cattle at a date and time requested by authorities. Would you do it? And so the things that fell into it, we had behavioral beliefs. So again, these kind of positive beliefs about, reducing economic impact, stopping the spread of disease. Is that going to be a good thing? You're more likely to gather and hold. Control beliefs. So if you have the facilities, the manpower, and the financial resources to gather and hold your cattle, obviously you're more likely to gather and hold your cattle. And of course, we coded all these to be positive, so they all sound good, right? But the opposite of that would be if you don't have those, you're less likely to gather and hold. In this model, trust in other producers was significant, which was very interesting. Rather than trust in agricultural authorities, which are the ones asking you to do this, it's actually what do you think the other producers are going to do that had the greatest effect. And if you think your other producers are gathering and holding your cattle and doing what's asked of them, you're more likely to do it as well. So here's where a situation where communicating about what's happening in the broader agricultural community can have a really positive impact on cooperation. And then lastly, here we again have this risk perception with this sort of inverse effect that at medium levels of risk perception, compliance is pretty good. And then as risk perception gets out there and becomes very high, your compliance or your cooperation drops off significantly. So you can see anytime once you get over the mean, which these are factors, so they're not easy to explain in terms of a number, but once you kind of get over that average level of risk perception, the compliance quickly drops off. Here's that question about trust in other producers. And you can see that in general, Texas producers seem to trust other Texas producers to do what needs to be done during an outbreak. And so you have a lot of people who are kind of mostly sure that their neighbors are going to do what they're supposed to do. And that was a significant predictor. Same risk perception factor loadings that you saw before. And again, it's this factor, so economic devastation. How certain is that? Or how much do you believe that's going to happen? That really drove your willingness to gather and hold. And once this reaches a high level, then They say no, I'm not getting my cows out. The last behavior that we looked at was animal movement restrictions. So would you keep your cattle in place wherever they are during the outbreak? And this model actually came out really interesting, but also a little unstable. And what you saw was that there were only 1% of producers who disagreed. And so if you look at the standard errors on here, you'll find that they're enormous. But because it shows the same trends as the other models, I went ahead and included it. We have to kind of take it with a grain of salt here, our giant standard errors. So in this model, what we found is that rather than some of the others where you had a lot of these behavioral beliefs, specific beliefs about positive consequences of doing things, for movement restrictions, very interesting, this is the only model where attitudes went directly into the model, and specifically the attitudes related to how unpleasant, how difficult, and how inconvenient those movement restrictions were, really determined whether or not they would keep their cattle in place. And so the converse of that is if you can make them any more pleasant or easy or convenient, then they were much more likely to comply. We also had control beliefs, so do you have the feed, do you have the facilities, can you set up disinfection for you and your employees? If those things are in place, then they were much more likely to comply. Beliefs about what other producers like themselves would do, so these normative beliefs. So again, if everybody else is doing it, then they're more likely to do it. And then, again, risk perception went into this model, and we found that as risk perception became extremely, extremely high, compliance dropped off. And this was risk perception related to overall risk and probability, which is a little different than the others. So now, instead of this one, we get this one down here. Why that is, I'm not entirely sure, but I would say that these two probably aren't entirely mutually exclusive. And that risk perception in general can be kind of thought of as having these same trends and patterns across the different behaviors. So, based on this work, what were some of the key conclusions related to risk perception that we found? So, again, I would just emphasize that producers who view economic devastation as kind of this really likely outcome of an FMD outbreak are actually maybe more likely to report prior to an outbreak, but then once you get into, okay, I can take that back. So if it's a potential outcome, then they're more likely to report. If it's a certainty, if economic devastation becomes a certainty, then reporting drops off, willingness to gather and hold drops off, and movement and compliance drops off. And so when you think about things like secure milk supply, secure pork supply, business continuity planning and efforts, this really becomes important. Because if you can communicate those, right, that it doesn't have to be economic devastation as a certainty, right? It's going to be hard. It's probably going to be unpleasant. It's probably going to be difficult. It's, all of those things. But it doesn't have to be complete economic devastation. It can have a really powerful effect on producers' cooperation. So I think this is one of the last ones. But just to kind of close with a quote. So Peter Sandman is a really famous risk communicator. He's done a lot of work in a lot of different fields, but he's big on fear, and using fear to drive behavior. But he would say, while fear might be the emotion most conducive to action, hopelessness leads to inaction. And I think that was kind of very clear in the research that we did, and what we found is that when producers feel hopeless and they feel like it's the end of the world, then your cooperation and your compliance are really going to go down. And so it's important to communicate plans. It's important to think through business continuity and really be as realistic as possible about what would happen during FMD outbreak in order to get everybody on board, right, and to get them moving forward and cooperating and participating in preparedness and response.